To the CU Catecast, and we're continuing our series on the books of the Bible, specifically introductions to the books of the Bible. And we continue today with the minor prophets. Now, so far we've had Hosea, who was writing well before the Babylonian exile, even before the fall of the northern kingdom. And then we had Joel, or Joel if you prefer, who was writing after the exile. In fact, in a very tight window, if you remember, right around 400 BC. With Amos, though, we are going to jump back even before Hosea, because Amos is the oldest written text of a specific prophet in the Bible. And because Amos is very specifically prophecy and not history, we can say that. Now, of course, if we were thinking about someone like Elijah or something like that, he doesn't have his own book, but he sort of kind of does, and then you can get into all sort of semantics. But Amos is the oldest kind of book named for a prophet in the Bible. And so, unlike many of the biblical prophets, Amos is not a professional prophet. In fact, he goes out of his way to make as clear as he possibly can that he is not a professional prophet. Now, that can sound strange to us, right? We know about professional religious people. We can go back to Genesis and we can remember that Pharaoh, or actually Exodus, where Pharaoh is talking about his professional court magicians. And we can step forward to all sorts of different professional religious people. In fact, I am a professional religious person, so that's not too odd for us. But prophets we tend to think of as supernatural individuals, people who have a supernatural connection with the Lord, and some prophets are and some prophets aren't. But if you remember in the books of Kings and in the book of Daniel, there are entire guilds or labor unions, if you will, of prophets whose job it is either to interpret the holy books or to do the religious rituals. They're kind of halfway between a priest and a theologian or an instructor of theology. And so these groups were kind of all over the place. And in addition to those groups, which were mostly associated with bigger cities, there were also the wandering prophets, and we are a little bit more familiar with those. But if you think about like a Western movie, or if you think about a show set in the Middle Ages, there would be some kind of random traveling professional. So your cowboy would come into town or come into, kind of a zone, and there would be some random traveling circus in town. And of course, John Wayne would need to shoot at least somebody in that circus. Or if you go back to the Middle Ages, there would be a traveling barber walking through town who would not only cut your hair but would also leech away your wounds and and do surgery on you if need be. These idea of these wandering professionals, we don't have much of a sense of them. But 200 years ago, even in our own country, that was a very typical way things happen. And teachers would work that way, as would, say, notary publics, as would, say, legal people, and preachers would do that very commonly too. And so a professional prophet wasn't necessarily a mystic, but the amateur prophets usually were. And so Amos is very, very specific. He's not a professional prophet. He has no special training to be a prophet. In fact, he goes out of his way to say he is a shepherd and a dresser of sycamore trees. Oak trees can just pound sand. Sycamores are it for Amos. That's his tree of choice. And he was from the south, but he is working in the north. And you could imagine for any of us how uncomfortable that would be. And that's a big deal, and it actually comes up several times in his book where he is called from the south to travel up to the north and to do his preaching and prophecy there. And there's a pile of subtext that I'll mention a little bit more of with that north-south division. It's not necessarily super important to understand just kind of what's happening, but it's something that's going to come up for us when we hear about the name of the northern area he did a lot of his preaching in, which is Samaria. And that, of course, that word has a lot of baggage for modern-day Christians. Okay, so Amos is perhaps the most severe prophet in the entire Bible. In fact, he's iconic, he's stereotypical, because his language is incredibly strong, although it has a poetic tint to it. He is kind of like Hosea, in which that he has no time whatsoever for hypocrisy. If you're going to do a religious thing, you'd better, by God, do it for God. It better not be just a show. It better not be something that Jesus would call pharisaical. It needs to be done for good reasons, and those reasons need to be not just public, but they need to be internal. And so he condemns any religious ceremony that masks corruption or that masks hypocrisy. Public prayer, he says, should be accompanied by conversion in the heart. And so ceremony and worship that are absent that genuine internal holiness, for Amos at least, is basically idolatry. And that's a big deal because Jesus is going to pick up on those themes strongly again. Now, Amos is writing, of course, in the 700s BC, and so a lot of the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders are going to lose touch with that message of Amos. And so Jesus, when he preaches it, it feels quite fresh, but it's not something new. Amos is going to say a lot of the same thing that Jesus is going to pick up on, and he's going to do it very, very strongly. And we should add that Amos is a southerner, and so he sees the worship of all of these northerners as problematic to begin with because there's a temple where you're supposed to do your worship. And all of you heathen Yankees up here are just setting up altars on your own and not making the long drive down to the temple, and that makes you bad people just from the offset. This is one of the big problems that continues to be an understated and undercurrent of the fight between the South and the North. And ironically, it's continuing to happen in England and the UK even today, where the southern UK people believe that because we have London, we're better than you. And all the Northerners go, well, we don't need London, so we're better than you. And you have this kind of headbutting between England and Scotland nowadays. But there was kind of a significant problem going back a long way with the northern crowd of the northern kingdom having a back and forth about religious righteousness because of the presence of the temple in the south. And that creates its own separate conversation that's really not necessary to understand Amos, but which is a big seething undercurrent that is going to be very, very alive and well at the time of Jesus. Because again, we all recognize the name Samaria. We all recognize that the Samaritans are going to bear the burden of Amos's prophecy for a long, long time. Amos's prophecy is going to come true when Samaria is conquered by the Assyrians in the 720s BC, not long after his book is written. But it's going to be alive and well at the time of Jesus because we know about the Samaritan woman at the well. We know about Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, which is meant to be shocking. The idea that a Samaritan could be anything other than a raging religious hypocrite. And so there's a lot of undercurrent there that's worth kind of being aware of. And the idea that the North are full of hypocrites is something that is alive and well 700 years earlier. The people of the southern kingdom are going to look and see the fall of the northern kingdom in the 720s BC as the result of their hypocrisy. And so even after the Babylonian exile ends, the southerners are going to very happily ignore the fact that their kingdom was conquered. We don't need to worry about that. But remember how the northerners got conquered first, so they were bad people. We didn't get conquered because we're bad people, but they got conquered because they're bad people. And that current is going to continue straight through the time of Jesus and really until the fall of the Jewish state in the 70s AD, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, when the temple is actually destroyed in the 1st century AD. This is the first time we're going to start seeing Jewish scholarship that doesn't reference how stinky the northerners are. It's really a wonderful and bizarre sort of thing. Anyway, that's an aside that you didn't really need, but I find it absolutely fascinating. The book is written in 9 chapters over 3 parts with a very short epilogue. The first part, chapters 1 and 2, Amos is going to condemn the nations, including his own nation, for injustice and immorality. very, very stock issue, Old Testament kind of stuff. When we say that guy went Old Testament on him, Amos 1 and 2 is what we're talking about. Strong condemnation of the nations. Part 2, chapters 3 through 6, is going to focus on Israel, who is more to blame because much was given and much should have been expected. And so Amos is not just going to swat around the nations. He's going to say his own country failed. God spoke to them, he sent judges, he sent prophets, and they're still screwing it up, and so they deserve what they get. Now, we're also here going to hear the use of the phrase, the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord, which is something we've already heard in Hosea. We've seen Joel mention it, and it's actually appeared in some other places as well, including Daniel. So now we are really starting to see this theme that the prophets, the books of the prophets, all seem to lean on this image of the day of the Lord. And it's going to continue to be an important thing as we continue to make our way through the rest of the minor prophets. So part 1 is chapters 1 and 2, part 2, chapters 3 through 6, and then our final part, part 3, is going to be chapters 7 through 9, where we just get 5 visions. These are going to be your classic prophetic visions, and all of them are going to signal the impending disaster, which is now less than a generation away before the northern kingdom is destroyed. There is an image of locusts, an image of the word is not correct. It's auto-corrected to word dire. I have no idea what that means. But there's an image of locusts. There's an image of something else. There's an image of the plumb line, which is very, very interesting and worth reading. There's an image of a basket of ripe fruit, and there's an image of the sanctuary. As I said, all of them are about the disaster that is impending. And then, in classic Old Testament fashion, we get 8 whole verses of hope. After the world is ending and the Jews are bad for it and everything else stinks and it's all going to fail and God is going to send damnation and brokenness, there are 8 whole verses to feel a little bit better, and they're not really all that hopeful. They are basically, listen, after all, you people are dead and in the ground. Maybe God will do something with your corpses and your children's children, but you people have lost. It's a rough bit. So you have this kind of little epilogue, this promise of a restoration, but these people who are reading my words are not going to see it kind of thing. It's pretty tough. Amos, beginning to end, is tough. He has no time for anybody's guff. He is a southerner who is going to the north, who clearly has no time for their hypocrisy, no time for their errors and theological inaccuracies, no time for their fake religiosity, and it's pretty darn rough beginning to end. In some, he is the first prophet to have a book named for him. There's precious little good news for anyone, and yet it's essential to read and understand Amos if we're going to understand the teaching of Jesus, which is good. There's one note that I neglected to make that I did want to add in, and so I'm sorry, this is out of order. One of the reasons that most of the people preaching to the northern kingdom before the Babylonian exile, and Hosea did this as well, they're going to constantly be talking about hypocrisy in worship, is part 1, because those people are not going to the temple, but part 2, it's because at that point, basically everything socially is stable. There's no craziness. There's no chaos. The world is not impending at its death. Everybody's fat and happy. In the mid-700s BC in the northern kingdom, it's all going fine. And when it's all going fine, that's generally when hypocrisy starts to really pour out. And so for our perspective, we know that they were 30 years away from their entire place being destroyed and their population being decimated. They had no idea. And so the image of religious hypocrisy is often preached and becomes a theme of prophecy when everybody's fat and happy. You know, it's something that's been a common theme in the United States for a good long while now, because we have been, despite the political machinations and craziness of the last 50 years, in a relatively high comfort status. And so that image tends to end up appearing a lot for us for exactly the same reasons it did in the earlier prophets of the Old Testament. So that's kind of a little bit out of order, but it's still helpful, I think, to understand why that image is going to show up, has shown up, and will continue to show up in moments where everything is going really smooth and well. So Amos is the iconic Old Testament prophet. There is nothing happy to be had, only the vague promise of restoration. So if you are feeling really low, I recommend you shift gears and read somebody else. But reading Amos will not take you more than one sitting, and hopefully it will be very, very helpful to you. And so that's it for the Book of Amos. I've been Father Ryan Humphries, and this has been the CU Catecast, and I hope you have a great afternoon.